So I mentioned before that it can be a bit tedious to keep typing out the object hierarchy all the time. So typing out application, dot workbooks, parentheses, example, and then dot and whatever we want to do with that workbook. So instead, one kind of shortcut we can take to dodge having to type all of that out every time is to create a workbook variable. So this line here creates a variable, I've called it WB1, as a workbook. And so a workbook is a specific type of variable that we can use that will essentially represent everything up until this period here. So everything that comes before this. And we can save that as, or input that variable however we want to input that variable. So in this case, I want to set this variable equal to my new example workbook, which is what I will have just saved this as. So it's important to note that with workbook variables or worksheet variables, any type of object variable that you're creating, you don't just type WB1 equals and then whatever you want to set it equal to. You use the set command here. Set WB1 equal to workbooks new example. So that's going to be anytime you use objects or that sort of thing, you're going to want to use set instead of just the equal command. So moving on, to see an example of this in action, I've created some variables here. I've created WB name, WB full name, and WB file path, and those are all just string variables. And all of those are going to be, we're going to pull those properties out of our workbook here. So instead of typing out application.workbooks new example, I'm just going to type WB1.name. And when VBA hits this particular piece of code here, it will look back up to see what I set this variable as, and it will see it is this particular workbook that we're in now. So WB name should adopt the name of the workbook, file path will adopt the path of the workbook, and the full name will adopt the full name of the workbook. And we'll see the differences between these three in a minute because we're going to output them all in a really big message box, along with C. Now C is just the count of the workbooks. So we created a little integer workbook that we have here, and then we've told it just count all of the workbooks that I have open right now. And in theory, we should only have one workbook open, so this should show up as just one. If you have multiple workbooks open when you run this code, let's say you have 3 other workbooks open, then this would show up and count however many you have, say 3 or 4, and show that number instead. So moving on, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to create a B integer, and B is also going to be my workbooks count, and I'm going to make a little message box here that'll count how many workbooks that we have, but in this case I will have just added a new workbook. And so we add workbooks in the same way that we just set our variable up here, but instead of referencing a particular workbook, instead of saying workbook new example or something like that, we're going to use workbook.add. Now when we use .add, Excel is going to add a workbook, add a new file, open it up. It'll default the name of the workbook, it will default the name of the sheets, and it will automatically become your active workbook. So when you add a new workbook, it's important to note that that workbook will automatically be your active workbook. Anything you do from that point forward, unless you change your active workbook, will be in this particular new workbook that you just added. So after we've added this workbook, when we recount our workbooks, we should see this number go up by 1 compared to whatever our C was before. This next line is going to activate our workbook 1, then activate our workbook 2. And I'm going to show you this step by step by putting a break on this line. And it's okay if you don't understand what this break is or what step-by-step debugging is. We'll talk about that in the debugging video. But how I triggered this, I just click to the left of this line into this gray bar here, and we can see this red circle shows up. And what that means is that VBA will actually pause on this line and let us interact with our file or interact with our code or whatever we want to do here. So in this case, we'll be walking step by step through these two so that we can see the difference between activating our workbook 1 and activating our workbook 2. The last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to save this workbook. We can see the only difference between this save as line and the save as line up here is that I've saved this as a default workbook instead of a macro enabled workbook. And this time I've gone ahead and I've given it a password, and this password was put into the write-res password, which means when I open this file, Excel should give me the opportunity to input a password, and if I can't, I should still be able to open the file. It'll just be read-only. If I come down to this line, we can see I've closed this workbook. Now if I hit space here, we can see we have a couple of choices here. You can you can choose whether or not you want to save the changes that you made in the workbook. In this case, I've said false because I just saved it, so I know I don't need to save it again. But you can go ahead and change that to true if you want to save any changes if you're trying to, for example, write a macro that would close all of the workbooks you have open at once. Then you might want to use true there to make sure that all of those changes that you made got captured. Last thing we're going to do is open up the workbook that we just closed. And I'll show you here that we can input the correct password. So we're going to open up this workbook. Again, this is the same workbook that we just closed. Note that when we open the workbook, when we input the file name, we do also need to reference the file extension that we used. I'm not going to use any update links or anything. It's not a read-only, so it's fine. We're not concerned about the format. And we don't have a regular password on this. If you remember, we put a write-res password on it. So it's important that you match the correct location of the password. So in this case, if it was a password protected file, a regular password protected file, you would put the password into this input here. But in our case, we made this a write-res password protected file, which again means that we can input the password or we can just open it read-only. And so that's where we need to put this particular password. And again, we made the password, so we'll just make that same input here. You can also jump right over the read-only recommended if we wanted to. So we saved this file up here as read-only recommended, and if we wanted to jump over that, we could. And these, again, these front inputs are the ones that you will mainly interact with. So now we can go ahead and test run this code. Again, we can see I don't have any other files saved into here. I'll go ahead and go to my Excel file under macros, highlight test code, and click run. Now the first message box we get should be the name property of the workbook, which is new example.xlsm. So we can see this is, remember we saved this as new example. So this is the new example workbook, and it is a .xlsm for macro enabled. So we know our save probably worked properly, but we'll check in a second. And this is what the name property looks like of the workbook. It includes the file extension. So if you're ever trying to get just down to this root name, you're going to have to play a little bit of games with the string properties to try to eliminate that file extension. And we'll show you how to do that in a string properties video later on. This is the path variable. And you can see this doesn't actually show the file name or anything like that on the end of it. It just shows the exact path of where this file was saved to. This line here is the full name property, and this includes both the file path and the file name. So this is a combination of these two properties that we looked at before. So these three properties represent different things. They're all useful. They all have different cases where you might use one over the other, but it's important to know exactly what they represent within VBA. The last thing that shows up here is 1, which is our workbooks count that we did initially. So we can see right now I only have one workbook open. It is only this new example workbook. Now I'm going to go ahead and click OK. We can see that VBA has stopped on this message box because I put this little red dot out in the side here. So I'm going to make this VBA window a little bit smaller. I'll put it on the right, and I'll put this on the left. So now when I hit F8 on my keyboard, it will move to the next line. You can also do it from up here in debug, step into right here, but I'm just going to use F8 on my keyboard. So I'll hit F8 once and we'll see VBA execute this message box line. And we can see now it's reading 2, and this is how many workbooks we have open now. And this makes sense because we just added a new workbook. So I'll click OK. Now WB1.activate is going to make sure I have this particular notebook open, this new example notebook that we have. So I'll hit F8. We can see nothing changes because this was already open. This was already my active workbook. Now if I hit F8 again, we'll see this has changed to my workbook 2, which is this workbook that we just added. So this is what it means to activate different workbooks. It's the same thing that we showed earlier in the object hierarchy video on activating certain sheets. So it's important to pay attention to what is activated at the time that you are running particular lines of your code. Now just walking through the rest of this, I'll hit F8 again, and I should know that my file was just saved as the new workbook, which is just a default workbook. I'll hit F8 again, and it should close my workbook. So we'll do this. So we can see that that just closed successfully. And then the last thing it should do is open that back up, and it should automatically feed our password into the correct input when we open. So I'll hit F8 again, and we can see it has successfully opened up my new workbook here. Now I'm going to go ahead and close out of all of these. I'll close out of this one as well, and I'll go ahead and save this just in case and close out. Now we can see I have all three of my files here, which is what I expected. If I open my new file, we can see it asks for a password, and this is password for write access, or I can open it read only. So this is what I was explaining earlier, when if I don't know the password to this file, I can go ahead and just open it read only, and it'll open the file for me, but I won't be able to make any edits. If I input the password, then I would be able to make edits. If I open up this new example file, we can see it does recommend to me, it says the author would like you to open this as a read-only file unless you need to make changes. It doesn't ask for a password, so if I click no, it'll go ahead and let me in such a way that I can make changes. And the other way that you could get to that particular setting is if you go to File, Save As, Browse, under Tools, General Options, and you can see here this read-only recommended box is checked, so we could uncheck that if we wanted to get rid of that particular property. So in this video we talked about the workbook objects in Excel. We covered how we can interact with that object through VBA. We covered the main actions and properties we use in VBA regarding workbook objects, and we gave examples of how to apply those in VBA.